All right, so today we're diving into some excerpts you sent over from Chalmers Johnson's Blowback. Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire.
Right.
It's quite the book.
Yes, it is.
It makes you think about all the ripple effects of
Yeah.
American foreign policy.
It really does. I mean, it's a book that continues to resonate today.
Yeah.
Decades after it was published.
Yeah. That's a classic.
Yeah, kind of like it's like he had this crystal ball in a way.
Yeah.
Because he was writing this, back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And it's like he really foresaw how certain patterns in American foreign policy were going to play out.
And he doesn't shy away from controversy either.
No, he doesn't.
That term he uses, blowback, which was almost like a secret CIA kind of code word.
Right. It was a term that was used in intelligence circles, basically to refer to the unintended consequences of covert operations.
Yeah.
But Johnson, he takes that term and he broadens it to encompass this whole range of unintended consequences stemming from America's actions abroad.
Right. It's not just about, say, a terrorist attack.
Exactly.
It's broader than that. It's
political instability,
Yeah.
economic shifts, all these things.
And he starts with Afghanistan.
Right.
And makes the pretty bold claim that the U.S. essentially provoked the Soviet invasion in the first place.
Yeah, he argues that, the U.S., by trying to counter Soviet influence in the region, ended up essentially, helping to draw the Soviets into Afghanistan.
Right, so setting off this whole chain of events.
It's like
which has had huge ripple effects.
Yeah, a domino effect.
And then, of course, the U.S. gets involved in arming the Mujahideen.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Right.
Because he points out that you have these figures like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, who were involved in these covert Afghan operations.
In the 80s.
Back in the 80s, exactly.
Yeah.
So they're now dealing with the blowback from decisions they made decades earlier.
It's like they're reaping what they sowed.
Exactly. It's this, very stark example of how short-term thinking in foreign policy can have these really long-lasting and often devastating consequences. And those consequences can come back to bite us in ways that we never could have anticipated.
Like that whole thing about opium production.
Oh, absolutely.
In Afghanistan, after the Soviets are driven out.
Right.
It skyrockets like 18 times higher.
Exactly. And Johnson uses that statistic to really drive home the point that even when the U.S. achieves a short-term victory, it often comes at a very steep price.
Yes.
We may be creating even bigger problems for ourselves down the road.
Yeah, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about Okinawa.
Okay, sounds good.
Which is another really interesting case study in blowback.
It really is.
So Okinawa kind of makes you wonder, what's the real story there?
It's a fascinating case.
Why are we still there after all these years?
Well, Johnson uses this really striking phrase. He calls Okinawa an American military colony.
Wow.
And he talks about how the U.S. military operates there with this kind of extraterritoriality.
Meaning like they're outside of the local laws.
Exactly. It's like a separate world.
Yeah, and that's got to breed resentment.
Oh, absolutely. And he uses that horrific 1995 rape case involving U.S. servicemen as this really stark example of how that disregard for local laws and customs can lead to just tragedy.
Yeah, it's like a recipe for disaster.
It is. And it's not just about these kind of isolated incidents.
Right.
Johnson argues that it's the day-to-day reality of living with this massive U.S. military presence that breeds this kind of simmering resentment.
Like a constant tension.
Exactly. It's blowback in slow motion.
And he gives that example of the Futenma Air Station.
Right.
Which is right in the middle of a city.
It is unbelievable when you think about it.
Fighter jets taking off and landing all day long.
I think he says something like 142 flights a day.
It's insane.
It's unbelievable. And he talks about
Can you imagine
the noise pollution, the lawsuits, the daily indignities that people have to put up with.
Yeah, it's got to wear you down.
It does. And that's part of Johnson's point, right? Yeah. It's that constant tension, that feeling of being occupied.
Right.
It's what fuels that resentment.
Okay, so we've got these unintended consequences in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We've got this simmering resentment in Okinawa.
Yeah.
And then Johnson takes it a step further and he says,
he does.
The U.S. is basically fueling global instability.
Right.
Through these massive arms deals.
Yeah, he makes a really compelling case that, we often prioritize
The money.
The short-term economic benefits of selling weapons over the long-term goal of global stability.
He's like, we're our own worst enemy.
In a way, yeah. And sometimes we end up arming the very same groups that later pose a threat to us.
It's like we're selling all these weapons, but are we really thinking about who's going to be on the other end of them in 10, 20 years?
Exactly. And that's where this whole idea of blowback gets really interesting when you start to think about the rise of China.
Because that's the big question now, right? Decades after Blowback was written, here we are, facing a much more assertive China on the world stage. Is Johnson saying that even that is a form of blowback? He is. Johnson sees China's rise, at least in part, as a reaction to America's own actions over the past several decades. It's like they've been watching us, taking notes, and now they're ready to challenge the status quo.
So we can't act all surprised that other countries want a seat at the table after we've been calling the shots for so long.
Exactly. It's like, what did we expect? That we could just dominate the world indefinitely without any pushback.
Right. But just to be clear, Johnson's not saying China's blameless here, right?
No, not at all. He's not giving China a free pass. But he's urging us to see the bigger picture, to understand the historical context.
So it's not as simple as saying China's this inherently aggressive power that's out to get us.
It's much more nuanced than that. Johnson argues that China's actions are driven by a whole mix of factors: historical grievances, national pride, a desire to protect their own interests.
It's like this high-stakes game of chess where one wrong move could set off a chain reaction.
And that's exactly Johnson's point. We can't just react to each crisis in isolation. We have to see those long-term consequences of our actions. We need to be thinking several moves ahead.
Okay, so how do we deal with a rising China without falling into that trap of blowback, of making things worse?
Well, Johnson would say there are no easy answers in foreign policy, but he keeps coming back to this idea of prudence.
Prudence? What does that look like in action?
It's about acting with caution, with wisdom. It's about recognizing the limits of American power and understanding that we don't always have all the answers.
So less shoot first, ask questions later, and more diplomacy, more dialogue.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that sometimes we can achieve more by working together than by constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Finding common ground, building trust, even as we compete.
Precisely. Because ultimately, Johnson argues, a more cooperative approach, one that focuses on shared challenges, is in everyone's best interest.
Johnson has given us a lot to think about today, that's for sure. Blowback in Afghanistan, Okinawa, the potential for blowback with China. It can feel overwhelming.
It is a lot to process, for sure. But understanding these dynamics, being aware of those unintended consequences, that's the first step.
Knowledge is power.
Exactly. And it allows us to make more informed decisions, both as individuals and as a nation.
So for our listeners today, what's the one big takeaway you want them to remember from blowback? What really stuck with you?
I think it's this. We are not immune to the consequences of our own actions. What we do matters. Our choices have ripple effects, and understanding those ripple effects is essential if we want to build a better, more peaceful future.
We can't escape the consequences of our choices forever.
And that's what makes Blowback such a powerful and timely book, even all these years later. It's a reminder that we have a choice in how we move forward. We can choose to learn from the past, or we can be doomed to repeat it.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into Chalmers Johnson's Blowback. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.